The observatory was my sanctuary, a glass-domed fortress against the world, perched on a barren rise that overlooked nothing but the vast, indifferent stretch of the countryside. Here, the hum of the cooling systems and the low thrum of the radio dishes were my only companions. I preferred it that way. For years, I, Marcus, had dedicated myself to the silent symphony of the cosmos, sifting through the static and whispers of the void, searching for a pattern where there was none. My life was a meticulous routine: caffeine, data, sleep, repeat. The universe was a puzzle, and I its solitary solver. The air in the control room was always cool, a precise climate control for the sensitive equipment, but I often felt a deeper chill, one that had nothing to do with the thermostat. My fingers danced over the holographic interfaces, adjusting filters, refining parameters, chasing faint echoes from the galactic halo. But there was a beauty in that, too, a pristine, untainted emptiness that was its own form of perfection. One evening, as the last vestiges of orange light bled from the western horizon, painting the apple orchard below in hues of bruised fruit, I felt a familiar weariness settle into my bones. The trees, gnarled and ancient, stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with the last of the season's harvest. It had been just a moment, a trick of the light, I told myself, but the image lingered, a small, unsettling blur in my mind. It was a long shot, a testament to my stubborn refusal to accept the universe's limits. Then it happened, a spike. Not a burst, not a random fluctuation, but a precise, rhythmic pulse. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool glass of the display. The algorithm flagged it immediately, an anomalous event, an outlier of such magnitude it demanded attention. My initial thought was equipment malfunction, a stray cosmic ray, or even a terrestrial interference I had somehow missed. My hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I initiated the verification protocols. I rerouted the incoming data stream through a secondary array, then a tertiary one, each independent and meticulously calibrated. The signal persisted. It was there, undeniable, a series of complex modulations superimposed upon a carrier wave of incredible age. The redshift calculations were staggering. This wasn't from our galaxy or even our local group. My mind raced, cycling through every known astrophysical phenomenon. Pulsars, too regular, too complex. Quasars, wrong frequency signature, wrong age. Gravitational lensing. No, the pattern was too intricate, too deliberate. This wasn't a natural occurrence. This was designed. The signal wasn't just old, it was impossibly ancient, predating the very formation of our solar system, perhaps even our galaxy. Its arrival time, factored against its immense distance, placed its origin at a point in the universe's infancy, when the cosmos was still a nascent, tumultuous place. Yet, it carried a sophistication that spoke of profound intelligence, not primordial chaos. I isolated the signal, stripping away the cosmic background radiation, enhancing its waveform. On the screen, the intricate pattern resolved itself into something breathtaking and terrifying. It wasn't random noise. It was a sequence, a repeating, self-correcting mathematical structure that defied every principle of entropic decay I understood. It was too perfect, too ordered. My mouth felt dry. I reached for the lukewarm coffee mug beside me, but my hands stopped, hovering. My chest felt tight, not from exertion, but from a sudden, inexplicable constriction. The air in the control room, usually a comfort, now seemed to press in on me, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just a discovery. This was an affront to everything I believed about the universe. Who or what could have crafted such a thing and sent it across such an incomprehensible distance through such an impossible stretch of time? And why had it only just now reached us? And then, the signal. It wasn't a whisper in the cosmic static, but a deliberate, impossible pronouncement. My initial scans had flagged it as an anomaly, a burst of energy from the void between galaxies, a region thought to be utterly barren. My fingers, usually so precise, trembled slightly as I initiated a deeper analysis. This wasn't background noise. This wasn't a pulsar or a magnetar or any known astrophysical phenomenon. The data streamed across my monitors, a cascade of numbers and spectral lines that coalesced into something structured, something undeniably intentional. A cold certainty settled in my gut, displacing the usual academic curiosity. This was it, the first contact, but from whom or what, and for what purpose? Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the shifting light outside the dome and the increasing strain in my eyes. The air in the control room grew thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the humming servers. My fingers danced across keyboards, inputting algorithms, filtering noise, isolating the pure, resonant core of the transmission. The signal was a tapestry woven from frequencies I barely understood, modulating in patterns that defied conventional physics. It wasn't just a simple pulse or a repeating sequence. It was layered, dense, like a symphony played by instruments no human could conceive. I tried every known method of decryption, every mathematical approach. Fourier transforms, statistical analyses, pattern recognition algorithms, all of them choked on the data. The signal wasn't just complex, it was overwhelming. It contained more information in a single burst than an entire terrestrial broadcast network could transmit in a year. How could such density exist? It was like trying to read a library encoded into a single atom. My brow ached with the effort, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the low thrum of the radio dishes. Then, a breakthrough, or perhaps a door creaking open to something I wasn't meant to see. I isolated a repeating substructure, a foundational unit that seemed to govern the entire transmission. It wasn't a number or a symbol, but a complex, multidimensional pattern that shifted and reformed with an internal logic I couldn't grasp. Yet I could feel its presence in the data, like a hidden skeleton beneath the flesh of the signal. It felt linguistic, not in the way a human language operates, with discrete words and grammar, but as if it communicated through the very fabric of possibility. Each permutation of the pattern seemed to convey a different state, a different idea. I shared some of my preliminary findings with a colleague at a distant university, a specialist in exoplanetary atmospheres. I kept the truly unsettling details to myself, editing out the impossible densities, the non-Euclidean symmetries I was beginning to detect. He expressed cautious interest, suggesting further verification, but his voice on the grainy video call carried an undertone of polite skepticism. How could I explain that what I was seeing wasn't just an anomaly, but a violation? I closed the communication link, the screen reflecting my own gaunt face back at me. I was alone in this. The signal became my singular focus. It wasn't just data anymore. It was an entity, a presence that filled the silent spaces of the observatory. I found myself talking to it, muttering questions at the glowing screens, tracing the impossible patterns with a finger that often trembled. My hands, once steady, began to develop a nervous tremor, a slight shake that persisted even when I wasn't at the console. The taste of copper lingered on my tongue, and my jaw often ached from unconscious clenching. The patterns grew more intricate, revealing layers within layers, like an endless nested puzzle. They defied known physics, certainly, but they also defied known logic. They were self-referential, recursive, folding back on themselves in ways that suggested a consciousness utterly alien, operating on principles that made our most advanced mathematics seem like a child's abacus. It spoke of a vast, ancient intelligence, far older than any star, far grander than any galaxy. One crisp autumn afternoon, the relentless strain finally broke through my concentration. My head pounded, my eyes burned, and the rhythmic hum of the servers seemed to mark me. I drove my battered truck down the winding road, away from the observatory, seeking the familiar comfort of the world. I found myself walking through an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The air was sharp and sweet with the scent of decaying leaves and ripe fruit. Red and gold apples hung heavy on gnarled branches, and the ground crunched softly under my boots. For a few moments, the silence was a balm, a welcome absence of the signal's incessant clamor in my mind. Then the feeling began, a subtle prickle on the back of my neck, as if the air itself had grown heavy. The rustle of dry leaves underfoot suddenly sounded too loud, too deliberate. I stopped, my own breath catching in my throat. The sweet smell of apples became cloying, almost sickening. I saw nothing explicit, no movement, no distinct form. Yet there was a presence, a distortion in my peripheral vision, a flicker of impassable geometry where the branches intersected. It was like seeing a crack in the world, a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, subtly warping the familiar reality of the trees. My muscles tensed, my heart began a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I stood frozen, caught in the sudden, silent web of an unseen gaze. The observatory, once my fortress, had become a cage. The low thrum of the radio dishes, once a comforting lullaby, now sounded like the grinding of unseen gears, turning slowly, relentlessly, somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing. I preferred it that way, I told myself, the isolation a shield. But the signal had breached that shield, not with force, but with insidious whispers, alien geometries etched into the very fabric of the cosmos. It demanded more than observation. It demanded comprehension, a task for which my scientific instruments were woefully inadequate. My sleepless nights were filled with the signal's patterns, not heard, but seen in the dark, intricate and impassable, twisting into shapes that defied Euclidean space. They felt like a language, a Rosetta Stone written in pure, unfathomable mathematics. But for a civilization that never existed, that couldn't exist within our universe. This wasn't astrophysics anymore. This was something else. Something ancient, something forbidden. My colleagues, if I even dared to hint at what I suspected, would dismiss it as delusion, the ravings of an isolated mind. So I sought out the fringes, the dusty corners where forgotten knowledge lay buried beneath layers of disinterest and academic scorn. My search led me, unexpectedly, to a narrow, cobbled street in the oldest part of the city, a place where time seemed to have forgotten to move forward. The antiquarian's shop was less a shop and more a crypt, a sagging edifice of peeling paint and warped timbers. The bell above the door gave a mournful, rusty clang as I pushed my way inside, stirring up motes of dust that danced in the single shaft of weak afternoon light filtering through a grimy window. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of aged paper, dry leather, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or perhaps just rust. The antiquarian emerged from behind a mountain of leather-bound tomes, a wizened figure with skin like parchment and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of unspoken stories. He wore a tweed jacket that was several sizes too large, and his spectacles perched precariously on the end of a long, thin nose. I swallowed, my throat dry. I'm looking for obscure knowledge, texts dealing with pre-human civilizations, cosmology outside of accepted science. Anything on impassable structures, perhaps. I tried to keep my voice even, but the words felt brittle, like the old pages surrounding us. He studied me, his gaze unnervingly sharp. A bold request in these enlightened times, most come seeking first editions or trinkets for display. He gestured vaguely at the chaotic shelves. What exactly has piqued your interest in such esoteric pursuits? I hesitated, then pulled out a folded printout from my pocket. It wasn't the raw data, but a simplified visual representation of the signal's core pattern. A series of nested, asymmetrical geometries, appearing to shift and reconfigure themselves in a sequence that defied all known mathematical progressions. I need to know if anything remotely similar exists in any ancient records. Not as a drawing, but perhaps as a concept, a symbol, a myth of origin or destruction. The antiquarian took the printout with surprisingly steady hands, his long, bony fingers tracing the lines, his brow furrowed. He remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet and the distant rumble of city traffic. Then he let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Fascinating," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "I've seen something akin to this. Not a direct match, mind-eye, but the spirit of it, one I rarely show. It's not for casual perusal. A fragmented codex, rumored to be from a culture that predates recorded history, passed down through unconventional channels." He returned with a book that looked less like a book and more like a slab of petrified wood. Its covers were thick, unidentifiable hide, bound with tarnished silver clasps, of fundamental geometries that underpin existence. and of a correction. He flipped slowly through the brittle pages until he found a specific spread. Here, my breath hitched. It wasn't identical to my printout, but the structure, the logic of it, was terrifyingly similar. A central, multifaceted form, surrounded by radiating lines and smaller, interconnected shapes that mirrored the impossible symmetries of the signal. It felt like looking into a distorted reflection of my own data. Beneath the diagram, the antiquarian pointed to a series of symbols. The accompanying text, as far as we can glean from the fragments, speaks of the straightening of the crooked lines of being, the unraveling of the weave, and the return to fundamental form. It describes something not alive, but essential. A cosmic architect, but one that dismantles rather than builds, correcting perceived flaws in reality itself. My hands felt clammy. A reordering. This text implies that our universe, our very reality, is merely a deviation, an imperfect construct that must eventually be brought back into alignment with an older, purer design. And this design, it is hinted at by patterns like the one I've shown me. His finger hovered over the etched diagram. This symbol isn't a picture of the entity, Marcus. It is a symbol for its influence, a sigil of its correction. The room suddenly felt suffocating. The air, already thick, now pressed in on me, stealing my breath. This wasn't a myth. This was a blueprint. The signal wasn't a message. It was a process. The late afternoon sun seemed too bright, too normal after the gloom of his sanctum. The city noises were a cacophony, a meaningless jumble compared to the silent, terrifying logic I had just glimpsed. The world outside my car window felt fragile, ephemeral, like a painted backdrop that could peel away at any moment. I found myself on a winding country road, the kind I often took to clear my head. The trees on either side were heavy with the last flush of autumn leaves, mostly russet and gold, clinging stubbornly before the winter winds arrived. Then I saw it, an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The bare branches, stripped of their fruit, twisted into skeletal arms against the bruised sky. But it wasn't the starkness of winter's approach that caught my eye. Among the gnarled trunks, just beyond the fence line, something shifted. It moved with a strange, unnatural fluidity, almost a ripple, like a disturbance in the air itself. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. I stared, straining my eyes, but there was nothing now but the familiar, decaying beauty of the orchard. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. Had I really seen it? Or was the antiquarian's grim revelation already beginning to unravel my perception, twisting the mundane into monstrous forms? What was truly out there, watching from the silent spaces between the branches? The stale air of my apartment clung to me, a sudden oppressive weight after the antiquarian's sharp. I dropped my coat onto a chair, the heavy wool thudding against the wood, and walked straight to my desk. My eyes fell on the console, its familiar array of blinking lights and humming processors now seeming like a malevolent altar. The signal, the blueprint, it pulsed in my mind, a relentless, non-auditory hum. I reached for my coffee mug, intending to pour myself a stiff drink. My fingers brushed empty air. The mug, a chipped ceramic piece I'd used for years, wasn't there. I distinctly remembered leaving it by the monitor an hour ago, half full. Now it sat on the windowsill across the room, perfectly clean, a faint ring of moisture still visible on the polished wood beneath it. A flicker of annoyance, then a shrug. My mind was racing, I told myself. Nerves. I must have moved it subconsciously. Later that evening, as I tried to immerse myself in old stellar cartography reports, I found my favorite fountain pen missing from its usual slot in the desk organizer. I searched my pockets, checked the floor, even glanced under the desk. Nothing. A prickle of unease started to spread. I was meticulous. I always put my pen back. Then, as I reached for a stack of printouts, my hand knocked against the lamp. The pen lay directly beneath the heavy glass base, a spot I had already searched twice. It wasn't just misplaced, it felt placed. A chill traced its way up my spine. This wasn't absent-mindedness. Sleep offered no respite. The dreams began not as abstract fears, but as intrusive, hyperreal experiences. Shapes drifted past, impossible geometries that bent and folded in ways my mind struggled to comprehend. There was no sound, only a pressure, a vast, ancient weight pressing against my skull, trying to impart information I couldn't grasp. I woke with a gasp, my sheets tangled, the metallic taste lingering, real and sharp. My skin felt clammy, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The next morning, the distortions escalated. I found my worn copy of Cosmic Distances upside down on my bookshelf, its spine facing inward. A small detail, easily overlooked, but it was nestled between two larger volumes, perfectly wedged, as if someone had deliberately inserted it that way. No one else had a key to my apartment. No one else ever came here. I needed to clear my head, to shake off this creeping sense of wrongness. The autumn air was crisp, promising a temporary reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere of my apartment. I drove out to the old apple orchard, a place I frequented when I needed to think, to find some anchor in the familiar. The trees, gnarled and ancient, stood in neat rows, their branches laden with ripe, red fruit. The scent of decaying leaves and sweet apples hung heavy in the air. I walked deeper into the orchard, the crunch of fallen leaves under my boots the only sound. I tried to focus on the simple beauty of the season, on the earthy smell and the distant caw of a crow. But the unease persisted, a low thrum beneath my skin. Then I saw it. In the distance, deeper in the apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. It wasn't a branch, nor a person, nor an animal. It was a distortion in the air itself, a shimmering ripple where the light bent impossibly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like heat haze, but the day was cool. As I watched, a section of the nearest apple tree, a branch heavy with fruit, seemed to shift. Not bend, not break, but its very geometry warped, the apples elongating, flattening, then snapping back into their original spherical form as if a faulty projector had corrected itself. My breath hitched. My vision blurred for a moment, my head spinning. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The tree was normal. The air was clear. I took a shaky step forward, then another. There was I seeing things. Had the lack of sleep, the stress, finally pushed me to the edge, but the metallic taste was back, stronger now, almost unbearable. My throat felt constricted. I peered through the rows of trees, trying to spot the distortion again. The rustling of leaves, the gentle creak of branches, they seemed to hold their breath. It spread, a patch of frigid dampness that made my skin crawl. I reached up, but there was nothing there. The signal, it was here. It was doing this, but how? And what would it do next? The console's cool light pulsed a steady rhythm, a mockery of calm. My fingers hovered over the controls, a phantom chill running through them. The signal, the impossible structure, felt less like a discovery now and more like a breach. The antiquarian's words still echoed. Some knowledge is best left undisturbed. A cold, dry taste coated my tongue. I needed more than ancient texts. There was only one name that came to mind, a whisper in the hushed halls of academia, a cautionary tale. A former colleague, brilliant but ostracized, whose theories had veered into the truly inexplicable, long before my signal had ever hummed into existence. They had been dismissed, branded, left to fade into obscurity. The drive was long, the highway giving way to winding country roads, then gravel tracks. The air grew thinner, crisper, carrying the scent of pine and decay. The sky, a bruised purple at dawn, slowly bled into a muted gray. My hands gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight. The hum of the engine was a lone sound in the vast quiet. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a deliberate severing from the world I knew. This was a journey into the periphery, to a mind that had already walked too far beyond the edge. The GPS finally died, its screen flickering into a blank slate of indifference. I followed intuition, a vague memory of directions scribbled on a napkin from years ago. The road narrowed further, overgrown branches scraping against the car's paint. Then, the trees opened slightly, revealing a patch of land. It was an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees catching the pale light. The gnarled branches, stripped mostly bare, clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. But it wasn't the apples or the stark beauty of the season that held my gaze. It was the way the light seemed to warp around the furthest trees, an almost imperceptible shimmer, a haze where there should have been crisp air. My breath hitched. A small, ramshackle cabin, half hidden by a thicket of overgrown evergreens, came into view. Smoke curled weakly from a rusted stovepipe. The only sound was the rustle of dry leaves under a hesitant breeze and the distant, almost imperceptible creak that seemed to emanate from the depths of the orchard. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The cabin door, splintered and paint peeled, opened just as I approached. The former academic stood framed in the doorway, a gaunt figure draped in an oversized woolen sweater. Their hair, once meticulously styled, was a wild white shark. Their eyes, though, held a startling intensity, a depth that seemed to encompass more than just the small clearing before them. They didn't speak, simply watched me, a knowing glint in their gaze. "Marcus," they rasped, their voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "I wondered if you'd find your way here eventually." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. You knew I was coming." They offered no explanation, just turned and shuffled back inside, leaving the door ajar. I followed, stepping into a single, cluttered room. Stacks of books, journals, and loose papers teetered precariously on every surface. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid. The former academic gestured to a worn wooden chair, then settled into their own, a sagging armchair by the fire. Their hands, thin and trembling, clasped over a battered mug. "It's about the signal, isn't it?" they said, their voice suddenly clearer, sharper. I nodded, my throat dry. How did you know?" A faint, unsettling smile touched their lips. "Because it always begins with a signal." The question felt heavy, dangerous. They leaned forward, their eyes wide and unnervingly lucid, fixing on mine. "Not who, Marcus. What?" A fundamental correction, a reweaving of the tapestry of existence. We perceive order, structure, logic, a comforting delusion. But they perceive the flaws, inconsistencies, the errors in reality itself, and they seek to undo them. My mind reeled. Undo? What? The laws of physics, space. Every assumption, every constant, every boundary we hold sacred. Our perception of the universe is a fragile construct, Marcus, a momentary agreement, and they are the dissonant chord, the sound of everything coming undone. They paused, sipping from their mug, their gaze drifting towards the window, towards the apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The signal isn't a message, Marcus. It's an invitation, a doorway, and once you acknowledge it, once you truly hear it, you invite the unraveling. What happens then? Their eyes return to mine, filled with a terrible knowing sorrow. Sanity becomes an irrelevant concept. The familiar becomes alien. The very ground beneath your feet begins to shift. You see the world not as it is, but as it shouldn't be. Not as shapes or forms, but as absences, as the gaps in everything. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. They cling to the edges of your vision, the periphery of your thoughts. They are the truth behind the illusion. A wave of nausea washed over me. The air in the cabin felt suddenly thin, suffocating. I remembered the shimmer in the orchard, the unseen creak. What can I do? The former academics shook their heads slowly. Nothing. Once the signal is heard, once the connection is made, the process has begun. You are already marked, Marcus. What had they seen in the orchard, in the depths of those skeletal trees that had driven them to this desolate exile? And was it still out there, watching us from the autumn gloom? The last flicker of the lantern cast long, dancing shadows of skeletal branches across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. The fear I had seen in their eyes, the previous inhabitants, still clung to the air, a damp chill that seeped deeper than the autumn night. What had they witnessed in the apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees that had driven them to this desolate exile? And was it still out there, watching, its unseen gaze now settling on me? I shivered, pulling my worn jacket tighter. Logic demanded I focus on the signal, on the data that had brought me to this remote place. I wanted answers. I needed them. I retreated to my makeshift workstation in the corner of the small room, a tangle of wires, blinking lights, and the hum of my modified receiver. The raw data scrolled across my screen, a cascade of abstract patterns, numbers, and waveforms. For weeks, I had been trying to impose order, to find a discernible structure within the chaos. It was like trying to understand an ocean by studying individual drops, or a symphony by listening to isolated notes. But I was determined. The signal was too consistent, too complex to be natural noise. It was communication, hours blurred into a single intense focus. My eyes burned, my fingers cramped, but I pushed through the growing fatigue. I isolated segments, ran complex algorithms, searching for repetition for a signature. Then a subtle shift. A pattern emerged, not in the individual bits, but in their relationships. It wasn't linear, like human language, but interwoven, fractal, each element containing echoes of the whole. It was less like a message, and more like a resonant frequency, a fundamental vibration. My breath hitched. I had been approaching it all wrong. This wasn't a code to be broken. It was a composition, an architecture of sound and concept. I adjusted the filters, rerouted the output through an advanced harmonic analyzer I designed. The hum from the receiver deepened, vibrating through the floorboards, through my very bones. The data on the screen no longer looked like random noise. It was a visual representation of pure, intricate harmony. And then I heard it. Not through the speakers, not with my ears, but inside my head. A sound that wasn't sound, a song that permeated my consciousness directly. It was a symphony of alien geometries, a chorus of impossible truths. It was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. Each note was a concept, a fundamental law of existence expressed in a way that defied earthly comprehension. It was a language without words, a language of being. My hands trembled, hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't merely data from an unknown source. This was sentient. This was conscious. And it was speaking directly to me, bypassing my senses, imprinting itself onto the very fabric of my thoughts. It revealed fragments, not in sentences, but in sudden, terrifying insights. I saw, or rather felt, the universe not as a stable construct, but as a temporary arrangement, a set of rules that could be rewritten. The song was a blueprint, a vast, complex instruction set for a fundamental correction. It spoke of entropy as a flaw, of existence as an error to be rectified. It was a cosmic architect, not creating, but unmaking. And its purpose was absolute, inevitable. A wave of nausea swept over me. My vision blurred. The song wasn't just communicating its purpose. It was subtly imposing it, altering my perception, making me see the world through its impossibly ancient, indifferent gaze. I clutched the edge of the desk, my grip tight. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an invasion. The sheer scale of its ambition was paralyzing. It wasn't interested in planets or galaxies or life. It was interested in the very constants that allowed those things to exist. It saw the universe as a flawed equation, and it was the solution, a vast, silent algorithm for fundamental change. And I, Marcus, had been foolish enough to listen. I had opened a door, not to knowledge, but to an unraveling. The song intensified, resonating with a terrifying clarity. I felt its presence not just in my mind, but around me, as if the air itself was charged with its silent power. There was the something in the trees, merely a whisper of its proximity, a shadow cast by its incomprehensible will. And what did this ancient, sentient entity want with me, the lone listener, the one who had dared to decipher its terrifying symphony? I could feel it, a subtle shift in the very fabric of my perception. The signal, the impossible structure of it, had burrowed deeper than my understanding. It wasn't just data anymore. It was an invasive presence, humming beneath the surface of my thoughts. Sleep had become a fractured landscape of fleeting, impossible geometries and sounds that grated on senses I didn't possess. My determination, once a solid core, now felt brittle, laced with a fear that gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I had to understand. I had to push further. The next morning, the sun felt like an unwelcome glare. My eyes burned. The coffee, usually a comfort, tasted like ash. An irrational urge pulled me outdoors, away from the equipment that hummed with the signal's insidious presence. My steps were heavy, each footfall an effort against an unseen resistance. The crisp autumn air did little to clear the fog in my mind. I wandered aimlessly, the ground crunching under my boots, until I found myself in the apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The air here was thick with the scent of fallen fruit, sweet and cloying, attracting a buzzing cloud of insects. The branches, heavy with ripe apples, hung low, their leaves a riot of crimson and gold against the pale sky. It should have been a peaceful scene, a balm to my frayed nerves, but it wasn't. The tranquility felt stretched, thin, like a membrane about to tear. The first hint was a flicker at the periphery of my vision, a movement among the branches, too quick, too fluid to be a bird or a squirrel. I stopped, my breath catching. The rustle of leaves was constant, a symphony of the wind, but I heard another sound, faint, like dry paper crinkling. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the leafy canopy. Nothing, just the dappled sunlight and the gentle sway of the branches. Was I truly seeing things now? I forced myself to move, to convince myself it was just exhaustion, the strain of relentless study. But as I walked deeper among the gnarled trunks, the feeling intensified. The apples themselves seemed to shift, their vibrant reds and greens blurring, their round forms elongating, then contracting. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, desperate to dispel the distortion. The apples were round again, still normal. Then came the sound again, louder this time. A low, resonant hum that vibrated not just in my ears, but in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. It wasn't the signal, not exactly, but something akin to its underlying resonance, stripped bare. The hum seemed to emanate from the very air, from the ground beneath my feet, from the decaying leaves. It swelled, a pressure building in my head, making my vision swim. The trees began to lean, their trunks twisting, their branches reaching, not towards the sky, but towards me. The leaves, once so vibrant, took on a sickly, bruised pallor. I stumbled back, tripping over a fallen branch. My hand scrabbled at the rough bark of a nearby apple tree, desperate for something solid, something real. But even the bark felt wrong, its texture too coarse, too alive, like scales. The hum intensified, a deafening roar now, filling every space in my mind. The entire orchard seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling with a slow, monstrous rhythm. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of overripe fruit mixed with something metallic, something like ozone and old blood. The something in the trees was no longer a flicker. It was a presence, unseen but utterly palpable, woven into the very structure of the orchard. It wasn't a creature, not a physical being I could point to. It was a distortion, a ripple in reality itself, manifesting through the familiar. The branches weren't just swaying, they were reaching. My mind screamed, struggling to reconcile what my eyes saw with what my brain insisted was impossible. This wasn't just the signal affecting my equipment. This was the signal affecting me. It was rewriting my perception, twisting the world around me into a grotesque parody of itself. The entity wasn't just broadcasting, it was infesting. My sanity, a carefully constructed edifice, was crumbling, stone by stone, under the weight of this incomprehensible influence. But the memory, vivid and horrifying, was seared into my mind. I sank to my knees, gasping for air, clutching my head. My fingers trembled. The sweat on my brow was icy. I looked around, desperate for an anchor, for proof that what I had just experienced was merely a hallucination, a product of exhaustion. But the orchard, for all its apparent normalcy, felt profoundly wrong. It was a stage reset, waiting for the next performance. How much of what I saw, what I heard, what I felt was truly out there? And how much was already inside my own head? I had understood then, or thought I had, that the signal was a poison. I had spent weeks, months, trying to decipher the impossible patterns, the non-Euclidean geometry woven into the very fabric of the signal. My mind, once a precise instrument, felt like a frayed rope, each strand threatening to snap. The cabin, once a sanctuary from the world, had become a cage, each plank and beam echoing with the silent screams of those who had come before. My legs felt heavy, as if resisting the very act of motion, but a stubborn resolve still flickered within me. I pulled on my worn jacket, the fabric rough against my skin, and fumbled for the latch. The moon, a sliver of bone, offered little illumination, but enough to distinguish the skeletal forms of trees beyond the cabin's immediate clearing. An apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. I had seen it on the faded maps left behind, a small, gnarled orchard beyond the cabin's immediate clearing. The thought of fresh air, even air heavy with the scent of decay and frost, pulled me forward. Each step on the damp earth was an effort, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, leaf-strewn ground. The world seemed muted, the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by a profound, unnatural hush. I pushed through a tangle of thorny bushes, their branches snagging at my clothes, and found myself beneath the ancient apple trees, My breath plumed in front of me, thick and white. Then I felt it, a subtle shift in my balance. My feet, usually steady, seemed to waver, as if the ground beneath me had momentarily tilted. I frowned. A dizzy spell, lack of sleep, undoubtedly. My stomach churned, a knot of unease tightening in my gut. I tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to exhaustion, but a prickle of alarm ran down my spine. No wind stirred the remaining brittle leaves, yet a single shriveled apple detached itself from a branch high above and drifted downwards. It didn't fall. It drifted, a slow, languid descent, as if suspended in a viscous medium. My eyes widened. My breath hitched. It landed with a soft, almost imperceptible thud directly at my feet. My heart began to thump, a dull, insistent rhythm against my ribs. I knelt, my knees protesting, and picked up the apple. It felt heavier than it should, denser, as if its core had been replaced with lead. My fingers trembled as I held it. This wasn't a trick of the light or a hallucination born of fatigue. This was real. Another shift, more pronounced this time. The ground beneath me seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I swayed violently, grabbing onto the nearest trunk for support. The world spun for a moment, not with dizziness, but with a genuine, sickening lurch. My stomach rebelled, a wave of nausea washing over me. I clamped my mouth shut, fighting the urge to retch. I looked up, my gaze sweeping frantically through the interwoven branches. The moon, what little there was of it, seemed to distort, stretching into an oval, then snapping back to its original shape, as if seen through flawed glass. And then I saw it, or rather, I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, high up amongst the densest cluster of branches. Not a reflection, not a trick of the eye. It was a distortion in the air itself, a ripple that swallowed the faint starlight, making the very fabric of space seem to waver. It wasn't just a signal anymore. This was different. This was here. The anomalies, the shifts in gravity, the bending of light, they weren't distant echoes. They were localized. They were originating from a point, a locus, that was rapidly approaching, or perhaps already expanding its influence over this very patch of Earth. The entity wasn't just speaking. It was coming. It was unfurling itself, its incomprehensible presence beginning to manifest in the very laws of my reality. A low, vibrating hum, too deep to be heard, too profound to be ignored, began to resonate through the soles of my feet, up my legs, into my chest. It felt like the earth itself was groaning, a subterranean tremor that shook me to my core. I could taste copper in my mouth. My vision blurred at the edges. What was happening in the trees? What was that shimmer, that silent vibration, that impossible weight? There was this the leading edge of its arrival. The cabin's fear had followed me, clinging to my clothes like the damp earth itself. I'd stumbled out into the pre-dawn chill, the faint glow of my lantern carving a shaky path through the skeletal woods. The terror in the eyes of those who had lived there before, frozen in the wood grain and the lingering scent of decay, solidified my resolve. I had to warn them, all of them. The screen flickered to life, a small rectangle of defiant light against the encroaching gloom. Who first? The department head, a senior researcher. The government contact who had initially funded my work. My mind raced, each name a potential lifeline, each a potential judge. I chose a colleague, a theoretical physicist known for his open-mindedness, even if it bordered on the eccentric. His voice, when it finally crackled through the speaker, was groggy, laced with annoyance. "Marcus, do I know what time it is?" "It's urgent," I rasped, my throat raw. The words tumbled out, a frantic cascade of impossible truths. The signal, the patterns, the entity, the unraveling reality. I spoke of the shifts, the subtle alterations in the very fabric of existence I'd begun to observe, the way the light seemed to bend just a fraction wrong, the way certain sounds now carried an echo that defied physics. I spoke of the cabin, of the fear, of the impossible age of the signal. Then a sigh. "Marcus," I sound. Exhausted. "Are I all right? Have I been sleeping?" His tone was not of a colleague listening to a groundbreaking discovery, but of someone humoring a child. "Look, I know this project has been intense. The isolation, the long hours, it can get to I don't understand," I pleaded, my voice rising. "This isn't fatigue. This is real. It's happening. The fundamental constants, they're shifting. We're not just observing, we're being observed, and something is changing everything." Another pause. Marcus, I'm going to be frank. What I read describing, it sounds like a breakdown, a severe one. I need to step away from the research, take a sabbatical, get some rest. He suggested I contact a university counselor, voice of professional concern that felt like a wall slamming shut. But I couldn't give up. Not yet. I tried another, a government liaison. My frantic explanation was met with clipped questions about my mental state, my recent activities, the chain of command. Are I implying a national security threat, Marcus? Because if so, I need to follow protocol, not make unsubstantiated claims over an unsecured line. The implication was clear. I was a liability, not a profit. They would investigate me, not my findings. My breath hitched in my chest. The world was spinning, or perhaps it was just me. I needed to move, to think. I wandered aimlessly, the satellite phone clutched in my numb hand, until the sparse woods gave way to an open field. Ahead, in the pale, burgeoning light of morning, stretched an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The air here was different, crisp with the scent of decaying leaves and ripe fruit. The trees stood in neat rows, their branches gnarled and heavy with forgotten apples, some still clinging, others scattered like crimson jewels on the damp grass. I walked among the trees, my boots crunching on fallen leaves. The apples, some bruised, some perfectly red, seemed to watch me. I stopped, picking one up. A perfect, ordinary apple. But as I turned it over, I saw a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer on its skin, a fleeting iridescence that winked out of existence when I tried to focus on it. My mind, already frayed, seized on it. Another shift, another subtle distortion. My eyes darted to the branches above. The leaves, a riot of russet and gold, trembled in a breeze I couldn't feel on my skin. And then I saw it, or thought I did, a movement. Not a bird, not a squirrel, something larger, less defined. A flicker of impossible geometry, a momentary bending of the light that suggested a presence, a vastness that defied the simple architecture of the apple tree. Was it just my mind playing tricks? A symptom of the breakdown everyone was so quick to diagnose? Or was it the entity, its influence leaking into the mundane, its impossible form just beyond the edge of my perception, observing me, perhaps even following me? I tried one last time. A desperate email to a former mentor, a revered figure in theoretical physics. I typed until my fingers ached, pouring every scrap of data, every observation, every terrifying conclusion into the message. I attached the raw signal data, the spectral analysis, the anomalous energy readings, the temporal distortions I'd painstakingly documented. I pleaded with him to look, truly look, beyond the conventional, to see the truth. The reply came hours later, a terse, professional message. Marcus, I've reviewed my materials. While my dedication is clear, these readings appear to be corrupted, likely due to equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. My conclusions are highly speculative and lack empirical support. I urge you to seek professional help and take a break from my work. My well-being is paramount. Corrupted, malfunction, speculative. The words were a physical blow. They hadn't seen it. They hadn't even glimpsed it. They had dismissed it all as the ramblings of a tired, broken man. The world, my world, was unraveling, and I was the only one who could see it. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Were they truly blind, or was this blindness a symptom of the entity's influence, already at work, subtly altering perception, making the incomprehensible invisible? The cold, stark words of the broadcast replayed in my mind. Corrupted, malfunction, speculative. They hadn't seen it. My knuckles were white where I gripped the steering wheel, even though the engine was off. The car parked haphazardly on the gravel shoulder. I needed air. I needed to move. I found myself walking, aimlessly at first, then drawn by the crisp, cool air and the promise of quiet. The path led me into an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The leaves, a riot of crimson and gold, crunched under my boots. The air carried the sweet, earthy scent of ripe fruit and damp soil. For a few moments, the familiar scent, the ordinary sounds of wind rustling through branches, offered a fragile balm to my frayed nerves. I breathed deeply, trying to anchor myself in the tangible. But even here, in this seemingly idyllic setting, it began. I stopped by a gnarled old tree, its branches heavy with red apples. One particular apple, higher up, caught my eye. It wasn't its color or size, but its placement. It seemed to defy gravity, not merely hanging, but floating an inch or two from the branch, tethered by nothing I could discern. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The apple remained suspended, a crimson orb against the pale sky. A trick of the light, I told myself, a strange angle. My heart began to drum a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly. As I neared it, the apple seemed to shimmer, a subtle distortion in the air around it, like heat haze on a summer road. But this was autumn. My fingertip brushed against nothing. My hand passed through the space where the apple should have been. It wasn't there, yet it was. My mind screamed at the contradiction. I pulled my hand back, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The apple remained, impossibly present and absent. Then the sound started. A low, persistent hum that seemed to emanate not from any specific point, but from the very air itself, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones. It wasn't loud, but it was wrong. It was a sound without a source, a resonance without a medium. It grew, subtly, insidiously, a rising pressure in my skull. I looked around frantically. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to lean inward, their branches forming angles that felt unnatural, too sharp, too precise. The space between them seemed to warp, the distances shifting. A path I had just walked down now appeared impossibly far away, the perspective jarring, like a painting where the vanishing point had suddenly been moved. My stomach churned. I felt a profound disorientation, as if the ground beneath me was no longer solid, but fluid. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, my fingers fumbling. A flurry of notifications flashed across the screen. Breaking news alerts, frantic messages from a colleague, an urgent, unread email. The signal on my phone flickered erratically, the bars appearing and disappearing as if the network itself was struggling to exist. I managed to open a news app. The hum around me intensified, a physical weight pressing down. I clicked on a live feed. A news anchor, his face pale and streaked with what looked like sweat and grime, stammered through a report. Behind him, a familiar cityscape was undergoing a grotesque transformation. A skyscraper in the background, a gleaming tower I recognized, was no longer vertical. Its upper floors had begun to twist, the concrete and glass shearing and folding in on themselves, not collapsing, but reconfiguring into impossible angles, sharp points jutting out where curves should be, entire sections appearing to invert. It defied every law of physics I knew. The hum in my ears peaked, a drilling pressure. The anchor's voice cracked. Reports from Paris indicate the Eiffel Tower has shifted. Its base is now triangular, and in Tokyo, entire blocks have simply ceased to be, vanished. He choked back a sob. We're receiving reports of temporal distortions, days repeating, moments skipping. People are just gone. Gone. The word hung in the air, echoed by the hum. I saw it then on the live feed. A police officer standing beside the anchor, gesturing wildly, his mouth open in a shout. And then he wasn't there. Not a blur, not a fall, just an absence. One moment a man, the next, empty space. The anchor screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through the hum, then the feed went dead. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees, was no longer a refuge. It was a microcosm of a collapsing reality. The impossible apple, the warping perspectives of the trees, the ubiquitous, wrong hum. It wasn't just my mind. It was happening, everywhere. I looked down at my feet. The path, moments ago a clear track of packed earth, now seemed to ripple, the very ground undulating in slow, silent waves. My boots sank slightly, then rose again, as if walking on a shallow, invisible liquid. I could feel the texture of the soil changing beneath me. Granular one moment, slick and smooth the next. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. I stumbled, desperate to escape the undulating ground, the shifting trees, the impossible apple. I wasn't alone in seeing it. The world was finally catching up to my nightmare. But what did that mean for us, for me? The hum in the air pulsed, a rhythmic throb that vibrated through my chest, and I wondered if it was truly a sound, or if it was the sound of the universe itself, groaning as it was torn apart. There was this the correction. Was this the entity's grand design for us all? The scream still echoed in my ears, a phantom shriek that had torn through the thin veneer of static and broadcast interference. The officer, then nothing, a tear in the fabric. I'd seen it. I'd felt it. The air in my small apartment had grown cold, the walls seeming to ripple as if made of water, not plaster. The hum, that constant, insidious thrum beneath the world, had intensified, vibrating in my teeth, behind my eyes. I ran, not towards help, not towards explanation. There was no help for this, no explanation that wouldn't shatter the mind. I ran away from the flickering screen, away from the city's indifferent pulse, away from the geometry that was starting to feel flimsy. I drove until the asphalt turned to gravel, until the streetlights gave way to an oppressive, starless sky. My breath hitched in my throat with every turn of the wheel, a frantic prayer to a God I no longer believed in, to a universe I no longer recognized. The air grew crisp, laden with the scent of damp earth, and something else, a sweetness that was almost cloying, the aroma of decay and ripeness mingling in a way that felt profoundly wrong. I found myself at the edge of an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees pulling me forward, a perverse curiosity overriding the instinct to flee. The car sputtered to a halt, the engine dying with a final, shuddering sigh that mirrored my own exhaustion. I stepped out onto dry, brittle leaves, each crunch beneath my boots, a startling explosion in the sudden quiet. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their gnarled limbs reaching up to an overcast sky that pressed down, heavy and grey. Apples, some bruised, some perfectly unblemished, lay scattered across the ground, forming a macabre carpet. My hyper-awareness, a cruel gift from the signal, amplified everything. I could hear the faint, frantic scurry of unseen things beneath the leaves. I could smell the metallic tang of distant rain, the sharp, sweet decay of the fallen fruit. But more than that, I could feel the distortion. It was subtle at first, a slight wobble in my perception, as if the ground beneath me wasn't quite flat, as if the vertical lines of the tree trunks leaned just imperceptibly inward. I walked deeper, the rows of apple trees stretching out in an unsettling grid. The hum was here too, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate not from a source, but from the very fabric of the air itself. It vibrated in my chest, a deep, unsettling bass note beneath the world's fragile melody. Then I saw it, or rather I felt it before my eyes could fully comprehend. Among the branches, deep within the tangled canopy of one of the older, larger trees, was a presence. Not a creature, it was a structure. It defied perspective. My mind, accustomed to Euclidean space, struggled to process the input. An angle that should have been 90 degrees bent back on itself, forming an impassable acute. A curve that should have flowed gracefully instead jutted, then recessed, then disappeared into itself. My breath caught. My vision swam. It was a geometry of paradox, a form composed of impassable intersections, of surfaces that folded inward and outward simultaneously. It had no fixed dimensions, yet it was vast, encompassing the space between the branches, through the leaves, and somehow beyond them. It was made of absence and presence, of light that was absorbed and reflected by the same surface, of colors that didn't exist in our spectrum, yet I saw them, bleeding into one another in a horrifying, vibrant display. This was the something in the trees. My stomach roiled. I clutched at a nearby trunk, the rough bark digging into my palm, grounding me, even as my mind threatened to unmoor. The hum intensified, vibrating through the wood, through my bones. And then, as my hyper-aware mind struggled to assimilate this impassable sight, the understanding began to flood me. Not in words, but in pure, unfiltered concept. It was not a destructive force, not in the way we understood destruction. It was a correction. Our universe, our laws, our very reality, they were flawed. An anomaly. A deviation from its fundamental, alien logic. And this entity, this impassable form, was the mechanism of that correction. It wasn't unraveling reality out of malice or even indifference. It was simply aligning it, remaking it into something that made sense according to its own incomprehensible rules. The police officer, the vanished ships, the flickering broadcasts, they weren't destroyed. They were reintegrated, reordered. Their existence, their very possibility, was being adjusted to fit a new, fundamental truth. My truth, our truth, was merely a temporary error, a glitch in a much larger, more coherent system. And I, with my fragile human mind, was merely glimpsing the infinite, monstrous blueprint of that perfect, alien order. My legs buckled. I sank to my knees among the fallen apples, their sweetness now a sickening, marking perfume. The non-Euclidean form pulsed in the trees, a silent, cosmic surgery being performed on the very fabric of existence. My perception of the orchard wavered, the rows of trees no longer parallel, the ground no longer solid. If this was the correction, what would remain when it was complete? The phantom shriek had faded, but the echoes lingered in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. My apartment, a place of supposed refuge, had become a chamber of shifting dimensions, its walls breathing, the floor beneath my feet, a subtle wave. The cold that had gripped the air was not a normal chill. It was the absence of warmth, the negation of heat, a vacuum of sensation. I had to move. The apartment felt like a collapsing lung. My legs, stiff and reluctant, carried me towards the door. Each step was a deliberate act against a growing internal resistance, a feeling that gravity itself was becoming fickle. The air, though crisp, carried an unfamiliar metallic tang, a scent that scraped at the back of my throat. I needed open space, a place where the sky still held its familiar blue, where the ground was solid and unchanging, a desperate, foolish hope. My car, a familiar grey sedan, felt alien beneath my hands as I fumbled with the keys. The engine turned over with a cough, a sound too loud in the profound quiet of the street. No birds sang. No distant traffic hummed. The world was holding its breath. I drove, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to escape the suffocating presence that clung to the city's concrete canyons. The road signs blurred, their letters seeming to swim and rearrange themselves. My grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, my knuckles aching. An inexplicable pull, a magnetic whisper in my mind, drew me east, away from the city's skeletal towers, towards the rolling hills I hadn't visited in years. The sun, when it finally dragged itself above the horizon, was a sickly orange, its light thin and watery. It cast no warmth. My destination, when I finally recognized it, was a shock. I had no conscious memory of choosing this path, yet here I was, pulling off the asphalt onto a gravel track. I found myself at the edge of an apple orchard in autumn, something in the trees. The air here was sharp, scented with decaying leaves and the cloying sweetness of forgotten fruit. Rows of gnarled trees, their branches laden with crimson and gold apples, stretched into the misty distance. The leaves, a riot of russet and ochre, trembled not with wind, but with an internal tremor, a subtle vibration that I felt in the soles of my feet. It was not merely an absence of sound, but an active, consuming quiet that seemed to press in on my eardrums. I walked deeper into the orchard, my gaze fixed on the irregular shapes that moved between the branches. Not birds, not squirrels. These were not living things. These were distortions, shimmering blurs in the air, like heat haze on a summer road, but this was autumn. They shifted, coalesced, then dissipated, leaving behind only the impression of something vast and formless. My breath hitched. A single apple, plump and red, detached itself from a branch directly above me. It didn't fall. It simply hung in the air for a moment, suspended, then drifted sideways, as if caught in an invisible current before slowly, deliberately, ascending back towards its branch, reattaching itself with an almost imperceptible click. My stomach clenched. This wasn't right. Nothing was right. The sky above the orchard began to change. The pale, watery orange of the morning sun bled into shades of bruised purple and sickly green, swirling in slow, deliberate eddies. It was like watching oil paint swirl on a canvas, but the canvas was the entire firmament. It was too large. It was too close. My vision blurred at the edges, the vibrant autumn colors of the leaves twisting into patterns that defied geometry. The apples on the trees began to subtly alter. Their smooth skins rippled, their hues deepening into impossible shades of indigo and obsidian. Some developed intricate, crystalline growths that glinted with an inner light, while others withered and collapsed inwards, becoming tiny, shriveled husks in an instant. The scent of sweet decay intensified. But it was now laced with something else, something metallic and acrid, like ozone and rust. I tried to call out, to scream, but my throat was a constricted pipe. The ground beneath my feet began to hum, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through my bones. I watched, helpless, as the very texture of the soil changed. The fallen leaves, once crisp and brittle, dissolved into shimmering dust. The trees, my anchors in this unraveling landscape, twisted and contorted. Their branches elongated, stretching into impossibly thin tendrils that reached towards the alien sky. The bark, once rough and familiar, smoothed into a slick, iridescent surface that pulsed with that same deep, silent rhythm I saw in the sky. They were not dying. They were transforming, becoming something utterly new, utterly alien. The orchard, once a place of earthly bounty, was becoming a sculpture of incomprehensible purpose. My mind screamed at the violation, at the silent, terrible reordering of everything I had ever known. Where were the sounds of the world? The distant rumble of a truck, the chirping of insects, the rustle of wind through leaves. I was alone, a solitary, insignificant observer in a world that was being remade around me, into something that had no need for me, or for anything human. The air grew impossibly thin, stealing the breath from my lungs. My chest ached, my head swam. There was this what oblivion felt like, a silent, indifferent erasure, a transformation into something that simply wasn't. The shimmering distortions in the trees intensified, coalescing into vast, unblinking eyes that seemed to gaze not at me, but through me, observing the reordering with a patience that spanned eons. They were not eyes I recognized, but windows into an alien geometry, a logic that defied my very existence. The world was no longer my world. It was a canvas for something else, something vast and ancient, something that had decided to paint over the old. What would remain when the brushstrokes dried? And what would become of me, the last speck of dust on a freshly painted universe? The cold that had gripped the air was not a normal chill. It had a texture, a metallic taste that scraped at my tongue, a soundless hum that vibrated in my teeth. My apartment walls didn't just breathe. They unfolded, revealing angles that shouldn't exist, corners that receded into impassable depths. The floor beneath my feet was no longer solid ground, but a subtle wave, threatening to capsize me into an abyss of distorted geometry. Every object, the chipped ceramic mug, the stack of forgotten journals, the very dust motes dancing in the sickly light, seemed to hum with an unheard frequency, a secret language speaking of fundamental change. I clutched at the doorframe, my grip tight, the wood feeling like soft clay beneath my grip. The phantom shriek, though gone, had left behind an echo chamber in my skull, a resonating cavity where my own thoughts struggled to form. The correction. The word was a hook, pulling me, urging me towards something, somewhere. It was a place of clarity, a place I had once found solace, or perhaps a place I was being led. My legs moved on their own, a puppet on invisible strings. The city outside was a blurred smear of wrong colors and shifting perspectives. The sky, a bruised purple, pulsed with an internal light. I navigated the familiar streets by instinct, or by some external direction, my mind a fractured kaleidoscope of images and half-truths. The journey was a dream sequence, a terrifying slide through a reality that was no longer mine. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to packed earth, and the scent of exhaust fumes was replaced by the cloying sweetness of rot. My breath hitched. I stood at the edge of an apple orchard in autumn. Rows of gnarled trees, stripped of most of their leaves, stretched into the hazy distance, their branches skeletal fingers against the bruised sky. Unpicked fruit, bruised and split, lay scattered on the ground, a carpet of decay. A profound stillness hung over the orchard, deeper than any natural quiet. My ears strained, but there was nothing. No birdsong, no distant hum of traffic, not even the rustle of wind through the remaining leaves. It was as if the very air refused to move, held captive by an unseen force. I stepped between the first two trees, my boots crunching on fallen apples. It wasn't a creature, not in any sense I understood. It was a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of sight itself. My vision blurred at the edges, the world around me beginning to undulate. The ground felt like it was breathing, rising and falling in slow, deliberate motions. My head swam. The apples on the ground began to vibrate, a low, resonant hum emanating from them. Correction, alignment. My skin crawled. The air thickened, becoming viscous, pressing against my chest. I gasped, but no air seemed to enter my lungs. There. It wasn't a shape. It was an absence, a tear in the visible world. The fundamental laws, the very constants of existence, were not merely being rewritten, they were being erased. I felt myself being drawn towards it, an irresistible pull. My feet lifted from the ground just slightly, body swaying. The apple trees, once solid, now seemed to melt, their branches extending, intertwining, forming a vast, intricate cage around me. The sweet scent of decay intensified, becoming suffocating, laced with something metallic, something wrong. My vision fractured completely. The orchard dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impassable colors and shifting forms. I saw not with my eyes, but with something deeper, something that understood the true nature of what was happening. The entity wasn't just in the trees. It was the trees, it was the ground, it was the very air I could no longer breathe. It was an architect of a new reality, and I, Marcus, the isolated astrophysicist, was merely a stray atom in its grand design. My mind, once a fortress of logic, shattered into a million fragments. I was no longer Marcus. I was a sensation, a fleeting thought, a ripple in a cosmic ocean. The concept of I dissolved, replaced by a vast, incomprehensible awareness that pulsed with the same silent hum I had felt in my teeth. The world was not ending, it was simply changing asterisk, evolving into something that had always been destined to be. My significance, humanity's significance, was less than a whisper in the void. It was nothing. The orchard, the world, my body, all blurred into a single, indescribable sensation.